This is Eric Michael Loyd, MS in Clinical Psychology, Neuropsychology Concentration. This book by Dean Radin, PhD, Real Magic. It's a book that I had for a while. A topic that I've talked about, discussed. Psi, it's PSI. It's a topic in parapsychology. It also has to do with mental telepathy, premonition, precognition, things of that nature. There are research articles regarding it, evidence-based research articles that are peer-reviewed, and also have high statistical standards and probabilities involved with those studies and confidence intervals as well. This book was also endorsed by Brian Josephson, PhD, Nobel laureate in physics. I was going to read chapter 6, Scientific Evidence. The only way of discovering the limits of the possible is to venture a little way past them into the impossible. Arthur C. Clarke. The scientific literature relevant to understanding magic has been published in peer-reviewed journals over the past century and a half. It consists of roughly 3,000 laboratory experiments, each of which involved one or more researchers testing anywhere from a handful of hundreds of participants over years or even decades. With very few exceptions, these experiments are not designed to test magical concepts. They are conducted in the context of applying scientific methods to investigate psi experiences. When these same studies are viewed through the lens of esoteric traditions, testing magic is exactly what these experiments are all about. Force of will has been studied in the context of investigating mind-matter interactions, also called psychokinesis. Divination has been studied as variations of clairvoyance or precognition. Precognition has also been studied in, people see that in basic university courses on psychology, where individuals and electrodes planted in someone's brain can determine which finger or which eye someone's going to blink first, up to a couple milliseconds before someone actually does it. Theurgy has been investigated in the laboratory, typically in the form of mediumship studies. From a mainstream scientific perspective, the evidence of psi phenomena remains controversial. Some claim that the persistent debate indicates that despite a century of smoke, there's still no fire, and so psi probably doesn't exist. For stronger skeptics, all of the supporting scientific evidence, 100% of it, can be due only to flukes, flaws, or fraud. I'm confident that the dismissive, skeptical opinion is wrong. In my opinion, the primary reason for the continuing uncertainty is due to the assumptions about the nature of reality that are formalized within the scientific worldview. If one completely accepts today's worldview as inviolate or absolute, then the strength and quality of the evidence for psi simply don't matter. The phenomena are considered impossible, and that's that. This may be surprising to those who have been taught that science is dispassionately rational and evidence-based. Science certainly aspires to be driven by evidence, but as in any domain of human affairs, a few leading figures in each discipline establish fads and fashions that others are expected to follow, otherwise known as paradigm shifts or zeitgeist of the times, as people have heard before. The lens through which we look at science are not dominated by a few. Those same figures enforce the status quo by deciding who gets promoted and who gets grants to fund their research. This helps to define the boundaries of each discipline, but of course it also constrains genuine innovation. geopolitics of science is a fascinating subject, and it's central in understanding why psi and magic are taboo within the academic world. But it also threatens to deflect us from our main interests. So I'll set it aside for now and instead address the evidence from a different perspective. An expert analysis. The mathematical discipline that specializes in the evaluation of experimental data is statistics. Professor Jessica Utz is chair of the statistics department at the University of California at Irvine. In 2016, she was also president of the American Statistical Association, ASA, the world's largest community of professional statisticians. In her presidential address to the ASA, speaking at a meeting attended by 6,000 statisticians from 62 countries around the world, Utz said something that undoubtedly surprised many of the attendees. I quote a segment of her talk at length because it's directly relevant to understanding the evidence for psi. She said the following: "For many years I have worked with researchers doing very careful work in parapsychology, including a year that I spent full-time working on a classified project for the United States government to see if we could use these abilities for intelligence gathering during the Cold War. At the end of that project, I wrote a report for Congress stating what I still think is true. The data in support of precognition and possibly other related phenomena are quite strong statistically and would be widely accepted if it pertained to something more mundane. Yet, most scientists reject the possible reality of these abilities without ever looking at data. And on the other extreme, there are true believers who base their beliefs solely on anecdotes and personal experience. I have asked the debunkers if there is any amount of data that would convince them, and they generally have responded by saying probably not. I asked them what original research they have read, and they mostly admit that they haven't read any. Now, there is a definition of pseudoscience, basing conclusions on belief rather than data. It's called pseudoscience. When I have given talks on this topic to audiences of statisticians, I show lots of data. Then I ask the audience, which would be more convincing to you? Lots more data or more strong personal experience? Or one more strong personal experience? Almost without fail, the response is one strong personal experience. I think people are justifiably skeptical because most people think that these abilities contradict what we know about science. They don't. But that's the subject for a different talk. 6 Sigma. Another take on the overall evidence for psi is provided by classes of experiments that have exceeded the 6 Sigma threshold. This refers to studies where the overall odds against chance, after careful consideration of all known experiments investigating the same topic, are assessed to be over 1 billion to 1. Each of these experiments used protocols that avoided all known design flaws. An extensive due diligence list of possible design faults has developed after years of intense scrutiny and criticism of these studies, leading to bulletproof designs. Each class of experiments has been repeated from a dozen to more than 100 times by independent investigators at different labs around the world, with each class cumulatively involving hundreds to thousands of participants. The vast majority of these studies involved ordinary people, most of whom were not claiming any special psi abilities. This recruitment strategy was employed in most cases for pragmatic reasons. It's expensive to find and work with highly talented specialists, but it also provides an important benefit because the results are not based on extraordinary claims. That is, tests involving celebrity psychics inevitably invite attacks because it's easier for critics to believe that those individuals were just clever tricksters rather than genuinely talented. The other advantage of working with ordinary people is that resulting evidence then applies to the general population. In other words, we're talking not about X-Men, but about what is true among the general population. Classes of experiments. The 6 classes of scientific experiments with overall strong positive evidence are telepathy, specifically an experimental protocol called the Gansfield, for testing the existence of conscious telepathic impressions between pairs of isolated people. This experiment has been repeated by dozens of investigators around the world for 4 decades, including by avowed skeptics who, to their consolation and surprise, successfully replicated the effect. Remote viewing, otherwise known as clairvoyance and precognition, a method for testing perception that transcends space or time. Presentiment, a technique for measuring unconscious physiological reactions to future events. Implicit precognition, a test that measures future influences on present time behavior. This type of study was popularized by Cornell University psychologist Darrell Behm. Random number generators, RNGs, a laboratory protocol used to test if mental intention affects the outputs of random physical systems. This is a more refined vision of older tests involving tossed dice. An RNG is an electronic device designed to produce truly random sequences of zeros and ones, each with a probability of half, like an automated coin flipper. The source of randomness in these devices is not a software algorithm, but true random events such as electron tunneling in electronic circuit components. Tunneling is a quantum mechanical phenomenon considered in physics to be fundamentally random. Global Consciousness Project, a worldwide version of RNG experiment where the outputs of RNGs, that's random number generators, are located around the world, are compared against long-term baselines during events of major global interest, for example, terrorist attacks. This experiment differs from the previous 5 classes because it doesn't involve individuals studied in the laboratory, but rather is a global experiment including everyone. It also tests not the effects of intention, but rather the simultaneous focused attention of millions of people. All of the data from this project have been publicly available through this website from 1998, when the project began. After collecting 500 worldwide events, which took 18 years because fortunately major worldwide events don't happen very often, the experiment had achieved an overall result above 7 sigma. That's associated with odds against chance greater than 1,000,000,000,000 to 1. Other cases of studies that haven't reached the 6 sigma level, but may do so after enough data are collected, include experiments investigating the effect of distant mental influence on human physiology and behavior. In one variation of this type of experiment, a total of 51 experiments were conducted between 1977 and 2000 by multiple investigators at different labs around the world. The experiments involved more than 1,000 pairs of participants, with one member of each pair attempting to mentally influence the other's physiological state. The combined results were odds against chance of 15,600 to 1. The second type of experiment involved a laboratory test of Obi-Wan Kenobi's Jedi mind trick, as memorialized in his famous line in the first Star Wars movie. These aren't the droids you're looking for. These experiments explored if one person's intention could cloud or distract another person's mind. In a combined 576 test session, the associated odds against chance in these studies were a modest but statistically meaningful 100 to 1. In sum, when considering Yu's statement to the world's statisticians, the 6 classes of experimental protocols that exceed combined odds against chance of 1 billion to 1 and 2 other protocols headed in that direction, there's no need for further proof-oriented scientific evidence. Debates will persist over the best ways to explain and interpret these data, but the existential question that forms some of the psi exists is for all practical purposes settled. And that means what we've called magic, because we don't know what else to call it, also exists. In the rest of this chapter, we'll explore how certain aspects of magic lore have been studied in the laboratory. We'll look at experiments that have investigated how the force of will works, the role of belief in modulating performance, studies on divining the future, the power of collective conscious, the law of correspondences, the evidence of communication with non-physical entities, Most of the following studies were not endlessly repeated like the Six Sigma experiments. I reviewed those proof-oriented studies in other books, so there's no need to repeat them here. Instead, we're interested in the experiments that were designed to probe beyond the edge of the known into the frontiers of magic.